You're listening to The Virtuous Mind, a podcast from Providence Christian College that discusses all facets of the human experience and the liberal arts from a biblical worldview. I'm your host, Dr. David E. Alexander. What would you say to some politician who told you that the state can raise your child better than you can? My guess is that most of you would, in the politest of terms, tell that politician where the door is. In this episode of The Virtuous Mind, we sit down with David Goodwin, co-author with Peter Hegseth of the New York Times bestseller, Battle for the American Mind. In that book, Goodwin and Hegseth chronicle the intentional takeover of the educational system by progressives that started over a century ago. One of the so-called elite's deepest convictions was that they could transform America by infiltrating K-12 schools. And they believed that such a takeover was necessary because they could raise your child better than you. I'm excited to explore this history and how Christians can and are reforming American education. David, it is so good to have you.
My pleasure, thank you.
I just finished your book, Battle for the American Mind, and I wanted to get the conversation started with a quote from the book. It is my brokenness that brings me to this book. Our brokenness. Nothing but the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ affords these two authors, Pete Hegseth and David Goodwin, the sufficiency to undertake such an audacious task. Writing a book that motivates others to reorient their lives around the education of their most precious gift, their children and grandchildren. Why should people take you seriously? Why should people take that seriously to reorient their lives around the education of their children and grandchildren?
Yes, that intro to the book, Pete and I had a road that we'd traveled, and so that sentence really comes out of that road. I had been on a journey for more than a decade, probably almost 20 years at that point, uncovering what the progressives had done to American education in preparation for it, their ability to take over our hearts and minds, primarily of our kids, but then it generationally trickles out into the electorate, of course. We produced first a documentary on Fox called The Miseducation of America. You can still find that there in the Fox Nation archives. And after it was produced, a book seemed like something that needed to get out there, and we took that apart and reconstructed it. We came up with the title, Battle for the American Mind. It really does represent the scope and scale of the battle that we're in. I think education has been for a long time seen as one of those ancillary public policy issues that everyone just assigns a check, but nobody really wonders why this is such an important thing. And what we did in the uncovering the path that the progressives had taken education down in the 20th century, we make the case in the book that it was a much, much bigger thing. In fact, it is the thing that is driving a lot of the cultural chaos that we're seeing right now. So that's what we meant by it's humbling to try and come to this and say, hey, look over here, this is a big deal.
What's the problem that would require such a radical change that you're advocating?
Well, we cover in the book very early on the concept of paideia, and I know, David, you know this concept well. Most of us in the classical Christian or even in the strong liberal arts Christian tradition understand this form because it's a Greek word. It doesn't have an English translation. Paideia is simply the raising of a generation to think in a certain way, believe certain things, have certain affections, all of which align with a number of different allegiances. And one, which is the most common in history, is servitude, aligning oneself with the regime that is present, whether it's the ancient Egyptians or the Persians or even the Greek city-states for a long time. It's having young children raised to believe that their people and their empire is the greatest thing and that they need to serve it. It was the Greeks who originally said, what if we created a democratic paideia, one that could free the mind of a citizen to be able to act or think in such a way that they could be self-governing? Because self-governance was such a foreign concept, never practiced up until the point that they were talking about this. And the only way they came to the conclusion that that could be done is to develop a system that would train every citizen to think like a king, essentially, to think in terms of the bigger questions in life, the bigger things that are more important, which coalesce into a form of wisdom. And so that is the paideia that we were talking about. And of course, over the centuries and millennia, it developed into what we call the Western Christian paideia in the book. That was done through the Christianization of this Greek process in the early part of the first millennium and through into the scholastic era of the Middle Ages. And so through that whole process, Western civilization was formed. And now we tend to take it for granted because Western civilization is highly structured and ordered through the process of paideia, through the Western Christian paideia. And when the progressives had entered the scene in the early part of the 20th century, they had an aspiration to take this civilization, this thing we call the West, to a different place. But taking it there was going to require a captivating of the paideia. And so that's what this book is about. It's about how they captivated the paideia and returned it to a servile paideia.
The differences between what's going on in Christian K through 12, in Christian colleges and universities, at least at some of them, there sometimes doesn't seem to be much of a difference between those institutions and their secular counterparts. Why is there this sort of similarity in approach? And why aren't people noticing? Why haven't people noticed a lot of what it is that you're attempting to get us to notice in this book?
Well, you bring up an excellent point that it's very difficult to discern much of a difference between, for example, a standard Christian K through 12 school and a public school, except for the Christian school may have Bible classes and a chapel once a week. And the families that go there are obviously more likely to be Christian. And I think the collegiate form is seen some of the same. And much of the reason for that is covered, I think, in chapter 2 of Battle for the American Mind, which we call Commanding Heights. Now, a big factor in Battle for the American Mind is looking at Marxism and what is now called neo-Marxism. The original Marxism, as everyone knows, is in the 19th century the idea of a collective economy. And when Lenin built the collective economy of Russia in the early part of the 20th century, the problem they had was it wasn't working very well. There were shortages, starvation, in the 1920s, or mass starvation in Russia. And so he made a change to communism where he said, we don't need to dictate exactly how much of every widget is made in this country. We just need to control the commanding heights of the economy. Things like energy, things like steel. And by controlling those things, we can have downstream control of everything else. So that form of Marxism, of course, gave way to the educational Marxism that came out from the early 20th century and the progressives in America. And they had a similar form, which was, let's control the commanding heights of education. We'll control the accreditation agencies, the teachers' colleges, the premier one being Columbia at the time. We'll control the academic circles with John Dewey, William James, and others who were in the progressive movement, the expansion of secular humanism, the removal of God from the classroom. All of that was systemic. It wasn't so much that they tried to take control from a top down. It's that they took command of the heights of the educational sphere. So now every Christian schools, typically to get accredited, they have to have teachers who are certified. They have to be state licensed. That licensing process requires that they engage the system that the state has set up to train them. The colleges have to follow certain rules of academia, even if they don't come from the government. They come from things like how your accreditation allows, who they allow to teach, how much they allow them to teach. You know that game better than I do. But at the end of the day, it's the commanding heights of the educational world that are controlled by the progressives. So it makes everything look the same. And I think there's just a handful of us. I know your college, certainly the K-12s that I deal with through the Association of Classical Christian Schools, Our mission is to get away from those agencies of power, get away from those commanding heights. We certify in our K-12s, we certify our own teachers, we accredit our own schools. We do not accept government money. We do things to make sure that those progressive strings don't come in as much as they otherwise would. Now, having said that, we're 30 to 40 years into a recovery, at least in the classical Christian education side for K-12, and we're still working at getting all of that progressive junk out of the attic. Somebody set up the idea that we should have 6 or 7 periods a day with 55 minutes long and call them a Carnegie unit, and a bell rings at the end, and that each one has a subject, and those subjects compile together to make graduation requirements, which then get put on a transcript and sent to a college. Well, we can't find very many colleges willing to take a transcript that doesn't have coursework on it, so we still have to do all that stuff. But is that really central to education? Those are the questions we're asking right now in the movement.
We have a number of faithful Christians all throughout the country, right? People who love Jesus, who honor his word, and nevertheless may not see things as starkly as is presented in the book. Why is that? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how it has happened that the wool has been pulled over our eyes.
I think the best way to follow that path is to go the path that I went on this. So I just heard a lecture at one point from a Hillsdale professor where there was a quote in the lecture from a progressive educator in about 1916, where he said that the parents did not have the right to engage the plasticity of the child. And I recognized that there was something about that was sinister or more serious than what I had been taught about the progressive movement. I mean, I remembered back to my high school textbook, right? Progressives gave us the labor movement, 8-hour work days, minimum wage, all the, ended child labor, created compulsory education, all these things that they did that were ostensibly modernizing and good for the country. And so that's the narrative that we've all been told. Of course, there's narratives around economics, there's narratives around social policy, all those things. The difference is that education is wholly controlled by the progressives. It was an invention of the progressives, what we now think of as American education. That's why John Dewey is called the father of modern American education, because he so drastically changed it. He basically created what we now have. When the people who tell you the story are also the people who are the subjects of the story, they're going to tell you a story that makes them the heroes. So the progressives have long told us stories that make them the heroes. And when I saw this, I went to the library and said, I'm going to find that magazine, figure out where that plasticity word came from and what they mean by it. And I thought it was going to be easy because I knew it was in the New Republic. And the New Republic I had known was a progressive magazine from the early part of the 20th century when it had its heyday. And in those days, there were a lot of things going on. So I figured education articles would be few and far between. But in fact, what I found was that they were in every issue and there were lots of them. And it almost seemed like somebody had neglected to tell me this. And so after hours of pouring through these books and literally dust piled up on the bookshelf or on the table I was at in the library. On my way out of the library, it was late, the library was going to be closing in 5 or 10 minutes. I looked up and there was a section on education that I just happened by the providence of God to pass under. I mean, it's a 5-story library, so why that section was on my way out of the stacks, because I was in the archives. But there it was, and so I went in there and looked at them. Long story short, I found a series by Lawrence Kremen, one of the most lauded historians on education in history. He's Pulitzer Prize winning, Columbia professor, et cetera, et cetera. He wrote a series called American Education. In it, he tells the story, the real story of what the progressives were doing. And he pins it right on it. I don't have the quote in front of me, but it's in the book where he says, what the progressives were after was not educating children for the workplace or doing this or doing that. It was the control of the American paideia, and he used the word paideia. That's what triggered me to write the book and to get this story out, because the story's never been told. Kremen obviously told it, but he was an academic, so it wasn't popularly told. And the educational establishment quickly buried it. He's not well thought of in the educational establishment. If you go back, he died in the 80s, but if you go back to look at what was written about his work from the educational side, it was rather critical. But it's so well documented that nobody can really deny it if you read the books. There's 3 volumes.
It does sort of feel like it's this series of subtle changes, a tweak here, a tweak there, a tweak here, a tweak there, and by the end of it, you get a really radically different alternative to the kind of paideia that was once the dominant model and environment by which we raised and reared children.
I think for the most part that's correct, especially in the last 50 years. I think there was radical change in the early part of the 20th century. We just didn't know about it. We tell the story in the book. The story we tell is that of a thief entering a museum intending to steal their prized diamond. Of course, in order to steal it, you have to put something else in its place that looks like that diamond, cut glass, and that's about the right weight so that the pressure plate doesn't go off and alert people that this diamond's been stolen. So what they did in the early part of the 20th century is they made America that cut glass. They made America and patriotism out to be this cut glass, and they did it in the name of immigration, trying to Americanize the immigrants and also a few other things. But basically, they erected the American flags everywhere, the popularization of the Pledge of Allegiance, which was really funny. I mean, if you know Pete, he has We the People tattooed on his right arm. So, I mean, the guy is a patriot through and through, and he was shocked when he learned that the Pledge of Allegiance was actually the product of a socialist. Who the progressives engaged to try and create something that would replace the Christian catechisms in the schools. In some sense, later in the century, there was a pecking to death by ducks, and it was a short, small process, bits at a time. The early part of the 20th century, it was radical change, but people didn't know that this thief had been in there because they saw something that looked very valuable, the patriotic United States, and the fact that it had replaced Christianity in that place of a diamond. They thought that was okay. That was acceptable. The American people in 1915 would never have gone in Peoria for the removal of Christ from the classroom. Of course, we know that that happened in 1960 in its final blow, but they actually did the removal from the classroom slowly between 1915 and 1960. So you saw that happen.
A lot of Christians seem to sort of be willing to think that, well, these other schools, they're really just focused on developing these skills and developing these capacities for, my children to get a good job or something. And we can, or the church can, or these other places, we can take over the other parts of the person and fill those gaps. They're not really trying to educate the whole person. They're just trying to sort of focus on these bits and pieces of the person. My claim is that that's actually misleading and dangerous.
Well, it certainly is. We started out this conversation talking about the nature of paideia. And there's only really, that I'm aware of, two primary categories of paideia. The free or liberal paideia, which is that which the Greeks created and it descended through the Christians to become the Western Christian paideia. And the other is a servile paideia. And when you're being trained to do a job, it's a servile paideia because they're not developing the part of you that can think and work independently. And when you look at America and the West, what you see is a lot of our ability to innovate vocationally or otherwise, a lot of our ability to build businesses, to grow things, to create new and better things is a function of free minds. It's a function of being able to think in such a way and engage virtuously. I mean, obviously, another problem that has always reared its head is that commerce can tend to become an unethical sort of activity. And so in the West, keeping that moored to Christian ethics and Christian understanding is that fusion of Christian and liberal arts education, which educates people to be free citizens who are productive. And so the irony is that when we then try and extract all of that and go back to just educating people to be blacksmiths or physicists or nurses or whatever your vocation is, we're returning to a servile paideia, one where people don't think, they just do.
To move us away from this sort of liberal, freedom-giving, freedom-enhancing type of education and this more servile education, you say this: the latest iteration of this trend is the push for STEM, or science, technology, engineering, and math education, to be at the forefront of our classrooms. I'm guessing that a lot of people would not have sort of characterized or framed that push in that way. But boy, that's again a really challenging sort of way to think about this hyper focus on STEM.
No one's denying that science and technology have developed some amazing abilities and they have their place. The issue with STEM is that it's too obvious. In 1958, you have the Sputnik situation arise, and suddenly the entire country shifts its educational moorings over to STEM. Why? Because they think if science and technology are what we lack, then the best way to get better science and technology is to teach science and technology. It's a straight line kind of logic that when you think about the human experience isn't really true, because what you really want to do are develop students who wonder, students who are curious, students who have a well-rounded and broad understanding of things so that they can connect things metaphorically and symbolically in other ways, such that when the time comes for innovation in the sciences to happen, they have a more broad capacity for imagination. They have a more broad capacity for thinking. Certainly the liberal arts, 4 of the 7 liberal arts are math. Arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, all 3 of those are math-based, and that's the way the medievals use them. And math is a very important part of education, but it's a philosophy of math, because when you understand how math works, you're being trained to think. When you understand how to work a math problem in algebra or in calculus, you're being trained to do a monkey's job, essentially. A very sophisticated monkey, albeit I'm certainly not good at calculus anymore. But what STEM has done is created this bucket that is empty because it doesn't actually do what it says it's going to do. It doesn't provide better scientists. Where you get better scientists is you train them the way the liberal arts were trained. Every major scientific basis that we use today comes out of the liberal arts from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, where everyone, Newton, Pascal, Leibniz, were all educated in the liberal arts, and then they became the inventors of great mathematics, of original mathematics. Now, I suppose Einstein is right up against the edge of that time period where everyone was classically educated, and you move into the 20th century, and there have been a lot of good things that have come from it. But certainly, if you want to look at the biggest leaps in discovery, they were made by people who understood things more broadly than just STEM.
One of the things that you end up seeing too, becoming more and more prominent in the 20th century, is a kind of reductionism, where science ends up becoming the only method, the only investigative tool by which we can learn anything, by which we can discover any fact. Maybe together with a little bit of mathematics, though mathematics is difficult, right? It's difficult to fit into that hardcore naturalist sort of viewpoint. Certainly, there's got to be a kind of causal connection here between the abandonment of the liberal arts, the classical liberal arts, the abandonment of this Western Christian paideia, as you guys call it, and the hardcore emphasis and promotion on science and tech, and then science becoming everything being reduced to science. If it can't be demonstrated scientifically, then it either doesn't exist or isn't true. You can now imagine science in a more liberal arts setting where that kind of reductionism just absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. Science is one tool amongst many of them by which we can understand the universe, but to reduce all knowledge to science would just sound absurd in a more liberal arts setting.
I think we've already seen the outcome of that. If you look at historical science and the way it was studied, you had natural history and natural philosophy. Those 2 categories enveloped chemistry, physics, biology, those sorts of things. And then in the 20th century, because if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, they applied it to the social sciences and psychology and sociology. Are we, to paraphrase Reagan, I guess, are you better off now than you were at the turn of the 20th century in terms of social science? Do we have happier people, more well-balanced? On every measure, I've got a psychologist friend of mine who runs a full-time counseling business, and he says by every measure, psychology has been auguring downward and doing worse every decade. Its metrics are worse every decade. He said, compare that with heart disease or cancer, and you get a very different picture. Lots better success with those sorts of things. But the social sciences are a miserable failure. And I think that's pointing to what you were alluding to, that you cannot take everything and shove it through that mold. The science is not suitable for those purposes.
You guys quote Woodrow Wilson. Wilson says, "We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a much larger class of necessity in every society, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks." You know, this is explicit, as you say, beginning of the 20th century, they weren't necessarily hiding all of this stuff. And yet a quote like that, boy, I mean, that sounds like, we're dividing the folks into the haves and the have-nots, and, those who are going to be fully developed humans and those who are going to work for the fully developed humans.
And that's been their game plan ever since, and it still is. You see it. It's now folly to even consider that as immigration has grown in the United States, that we would try and educate the immigrants in the American way. That used to be what even the progressives were about at the turn of the 20th century, but it's not anymore, and it wasn't. What they were trying to do then, and what Wilson was arguing for, was to create an underclass that would be controllable. And I know this may be a controversial statement, but I can't see anyone at that time not realizing what they were doing, because Greek and Latin were the required languages to get into every university in the 19th century. What were you reading if you were versed in Greek? You were reading Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Democritus, all of the various, Xenophon. You can't read that and not know that if you create an underclass of people who are just trained to be vocational and another group that is trained to lead, you are creating tyranny. You're creating a situation where one group serves the other. And that's never been what America has been about. It's not about servitude. It's about freedom. And they were combating that. Now, we're not talking, I want to stay a long way away from the oppressor-oppressed concept, right? That's a whole different thing. You're not oppressing someone just because you're educated and they're not, or because you have money and they're not. That's all, neo-Marxist stuff. I'm not going there. I'm just talking about if you want to control a country, the best way to do it is to get the majority of people in it not to think, and just to do.
You all actually kind of indict the church at various points throughout the work. And you've got this section where you say this: "I've quoted Abraham Lincoln's warning that the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation becomes the philosophy of government in the next. The statement remains true, but it is incomplete. To put it more comprehensively, the strength of the church in one generation becomes the culture of its people in the next." The implication there is that the strength of the church it's weakened. And that's part of the explanation for why we have seen the decay in our culture. It's not just that it's happened in our education system and, somehow it happened sort of right below our nose and we missed it or something. It's that we actually see a significant weakening in the church as well. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, elaborate on that, and tell us, why did that happen?
Well, that's as much a part of the story as the progressive side. And it actually, there's a confluence between the progressive and the church side. So in the 19th century, it's pretty well known. After Darwin and the rise of that, and of course in the 1920s, you got the Scopes trial, but that whole period right in there between, say, 1840 and 1925, what you have changing in the church is that people either believe the Bible, in which case they are moved to the evangelical side that's more concerned with tent revivals and that sort of thing, or they're in what's called the mainline churches, and the mainline churches move towards the social gospel. The social gospel, the father of the social gospel is Washington Gladden. We talk about him, I think, in the book. They believe that the materialistic worldview is the right worldview, and so Jesus's miracles and the salvation and those sorts of things are irrelevant. What's relevant is what Jesus taught, because he was a great teacher. And as a great teacher, he taught us to love the poor and to help the poor and to do this. So they fused Christianity in the mainline churches into socialism, and that became the social gospel. Well, when progressivism took off in the early part of the 20th century, reading history should always be like watching a river. It's not like a bunch of events and dates. It's a river. What flowed into what? This materialistic idea that invaded the mainline church, which was the vast majority of churches at the time, flowed into the river of progressivism, and probably a third or more of the progressives were effectively clergy in the mainline church. And they joined forces with the socialists and the atheist humanists to do what they believed to be, they would say, doing good works, as opposed to worrying about the theology of salvation or anything like that. And so that was one branch of the church. The other branch of the church pursued exclusively the prospect of salvation by baptism, right? Or what intent revivals. And so because they did that exclusively, they quit having rich and deep seminaries. They started just leaving the academic pursuits to the other team. Guys like D.L. Moody and guys that we all know are heroes, Billy Graham. These folks shifted Christianity away from engagement with culture and into just sort of a box of its own. And that isolated what's now called evangelical Christianity and took it away from the political process. The main line was corrupted by the political process. So you've got a situation where the church divided and the void in between the two is palpable, and it's what we're seeing today. So that's why the church is failing to cultivate the hearts and minds of kids to think about Jesus not just as the Lord of their souls, but also as the Lord of their nation, the Lord of of the way the world works, the Lord of science, the Lord of math, the Lord of every aspect. As Abraham Kuyper put it, not one square inch of creation exists that Jesus does not say, "This is mine." So returning to that Kuyperian vision is going to be hard. It's going to take some time. But the church is, I think, the optimistic thing is the church is always under the influence of the Holy Spirit. And I think the Holy Spirit is going to return, bring back a revival of total Christianity with total truth, where both our Sunday lives and our daily lives are united. And I'll say that there's that quote in the book from Charles Potter, who was an atheistic humanist who co-signed the Humanist Manifesto with John Dewey, the father of modern American education, as I said, where he says, you give me the kids for 6 days a week with a humanistic education, and the church can have them on Sunday. They aren't going to be able to overcome what we can do in 6 days a week. And it was prophetic. He said that in the 30s, and it's true. But what I would say, too, is that I went to what was considered at the time a conservative Christian college, Seattle Pacific University in the 80s. The problem was you had some liberal professors. All right, you can deal with liberal professors. I'm thankful for places like Providence where you don't have that kind of thing. But I will say that the challenge is very different now, because it's not so much what's influencing your kid in terms of the professors. It's who's influencing your kid in terms of their peers. If you're in a dorm or, anywhere in which you're living with fellow students, and they have all been indoctrinated into the cultural Marxist mechanism that is dominant in our culture since about 2000, you now aren't just going up against a professor that you see 1 hour once a week. You're going up against peers who hate you for your views. And that's a hard burden to bear.
David, thank you so much for being here. I want to encourage all of our listeners to check out the book, Battle for the American Mind. It is it's a page turner. I gave it to my wife and she couldn't put it down. David, I want to end our time together by hearing about some of the positives. You talk about how the classical Christian education movement that started 30, 40 years ago has really taken off.
People have gotten a lot more interested in the book. I think that's why it became, a number one bestseller. People were looking for some optimism, some hope. And the thing is that we can't do a lot about what's going on in the elections as individuals. We can't do a lot about what our neighbors think. What we can do is we can educate our kids. And the multiplying effect of that is powerful. So I have 3 kids. They don't have children yet, but as they start to have kids, any investment I'm putting into them right now is going to be multiplied out there. The further out you go, the more people are going to be influenced by this. And we're seeing this across the country. So back 20, 30 years ago when we were working on schools, we were having to teach our teachers how to teach classically. It was very hard to do because nobody was classically educated. Now the school that I helped found just a mile from here has numerous teachers at it who went through our school and then went to classical colleges. So we're actually developing our own ecosystem within the Classical Christian Network. And you guys are helping with that, being in the collegiate side, because we have to take students, finish them there, and then bring them back into our ranks. They have children then. They grow, even if they don't go into education, those children are in homes where the Western Christian Paideia is taught. And that's the hope. Some people want a quicker fix than that, but there's no more sure fix than a generational fix. And I think that's where we are. That's why we're optimistic.
You've been listening to The Virtuous Mind, a podcast from Providence Christian College. The mission of Providence Christian College as a reformed Christian institution is to equip students to be firmly grounded in biblical truth, thoroughly educated in the liberal arts, and fully engaged in their church, their community, and the world for the glory of God and for service to humanity. We'd love to have you visit our campus. Providence Christian College is now accepting applications for the upcoming semester. Contact an admissions counselor to learn more. Visit providencecc.edu.